you have an hour or half an hour, 45 minutes to like capture somebody's attention, make them fall in love with you and hear your pitch. Whereas with a social media ad, you have less than a second usually. I think it's like a 3/4 of a second before somebody moves along, whether they decide whether to click on that ad or not, right?
Yeah.
So you just have, it's so much more effective. If you can hook somebody into 2 episodes and they fall in love with your personality, you're set.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to In-House Podcast. I actually have a very special guest today. I have Brayden coming from behind the scenes to front of the camera.
Actually, I prefer the Podfather.
I'm sorry, Podfather. Yes, Podfather.
No, that's fine. I accept Brayden as well.
Well, if you guys don't know the Podfather, he actually is in the series, the Oakland Podcast.
That's right. You may know me from other podcasts such as, well, just that one, actually. I've been a guest on one other podcast. Shout out to Marketing News Canada. But aside from that, this will be my third podcast experience.
Oh, really? Okay. So what, do you like being behind the scenes more, or do you enjoy being in front of the camera?
I used to play in bands and I used to want to be in front of the mics, so to say. And then at some point I realized like, I kind of just like slinking into the background and like recording things because I just really like recording things.
Did I know that? I know that you worked at a music studio, like a music school.
The school, yeah.
But I didn't know that you were actually in a band.
Oh yeah, like that's where my whole like audio history started. It was playing in bands since I was like, I started playing guitar at 13 and started a band when I was 15 and started recording myself. And that's, so I've been doing this for like, what's that, 23 years now, 24 years.
So the guitar pieces that are in the studio are not just for show.
No, I can't actually play them. And I do, pick up the acoustic almost every night and just pluck around on it.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be a rock star anymore, though.
Well, you are a rock star to us, to me and Tony. We've been with you for 4 years now. And I want to say, like, the experience have made us, like the experience with you have made us, that's the reason why we've actually lasted this long.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's, when you think about like the statistics of podcasting, most podcasts don't last more than, the vast majority, like 90% of podcasts don't have more than 3 episodes.
Right?
Yeah.
Were you the one that told me that statistic?
I think probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was shocked.
Like, yeah. It does seem ridiculous, but if you think about how, like, I don't know, like, just, I don't want to say how, it's rude to say how flaky people are as a species, but I think it would make more sense to say how much work it is to do a podcast. Like how just you think that it's just hopping in front of a mic and then just uploading it to the internet, but there's like about 400 steps in between there. So especially if you really want to take the effort to make it sound good and make it flow well, there's a lot of editing, there's a lot of piecing things together, there's just a lot of file management. There's just a lot of things.
Yeah. And this is the way, like Tony and I, what we do is we are scheduling guests behind the scenes. We're thinking of great topics based on what agents in the field are sharing with us and some of the difficulties and challenges. And then we come up with all these, topics of interest that our listeners would tune into. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of hours that are going into the production, the editing, and even just the back and forth of after the first version of the editing. So I want to know, obviously, your experience comes from working in the music industry.
Yeah.
But what got you into actually niching in podcasts?
It was actually Matt and Adam Scalina. I started working with them, or there was an opportunity that came up in 2017, I think it was. Yeah, it would have been 2017. And I had just gotten rid of my real estate license, or maybe I still had it. I can't remember, but I was kind of on the outs of my real estate career. I was not a big fan of it anymore, and just wanted to focus on audio stuff. And there's this opportunity that popped up to work with Matt and Adam Scalina on their Vancouver real estate podcast. And shout out to those guys. I love them lots. The pay wasn't great, but it was, it's like basically it was like a low level kind of like, it was a podcast producer slash like kind of assistant job. And I was like, well, this isn't really what I want to be doing with my career, but I kind of like, I I I saw an opportunity in the idea of learning how to do podcasts, because I think I saw that if they can, have that as part of their marketing arm, there's got to be some value to podcasting. I didn't really quite get it. I didn't listen to podcasts at the time, but I kind of saw I knew that down the road there would be something that would be beneficial to learning how to do that. And it was kind of this weird like little intuition where part of my brain said, no, you need to find a job that makes more money. And the other part of my brain said, there's an opportunity here, right? And so that's where it all started. And from that, it led to them saying, "Oh, our brokerage wants to start a podcast." And so then I'd never done a podcast launch, and so I did one with the Oakland podcast, and then that led to you and Tony coming aboard, and because the brokerage was like, "We have these realtors that want to start, or we have this realtor and her partner that wants to start a podcast," and I was like, "Okay, let's do that." And then I was like,
that was during the pandemic?
yeah, and I had a full-time job working at the school as a studio manager, but they were pretty flexible about, because they also didn't pay a lot, but they let me kind of, if I needed to take a day to go record, I could do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those 3 podcasts, I was like, well, there's a possibility I can make a business out of this. And then I just made the decision. I said, I'm going to leave the school in 3 months. I said, you got 3 months to find a replacement for me, but I'm going to like go out on my own and just start a business. And that was terrifying, but it worked out. I did some cold calling, got some clients from cold calling, like just you called back to my realtor, like my old realtor days of door knocking. And I was surprised by how, how many doors you get slammed in your face and how many no's you get when you're cold calling in real estate. It wasn't really like that. People were kind of like more along the lines of, well, that's an interesting idea. Like, convince me why I should do it. And then I was like, oh, okay.
Oh, so they never even thought of actually launching a podcast of their own?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it's like I was surprised at how open people were to the idea. Just after coming from real estate and having so many people saying, "Get off my front doorstep." It's just surprised at how open people were.
Okay, let's move backwards here, because I would say around the first 6 months of us recording together, Podfather Creative was born.
Oh yeah, it was just
Where did that name come from?
If I remember correctly, I was just on my way. I was driving on the Coca-Cola with my family, going on some sort of camping trip or some sort of family vacation. And I knew I had to come up with a business name. And this was my opportunity, like just tune the family out. And like, I think I put earplugs in and I just started thinking about business names. And every time I would have a good one, I would tell it to my wife and she would write it in my phone in like this notes app. And then when we got to a rest stop, like I think at the top of the Coca-Cola, I remember I got out and I found some self-service, like a couple bars. And I went on GoDaddy and started Googling and figuring out which domain names were available. Mm-hmm. And Podfather, my favorite one was Podfather, but it was taken. I think that's like some sort of logistics company or something. So I said, okay, what if I just tacked on the word creative on the end? And
right.
Podfather Creative was open, and that's what it became. But I think, it was a short list. I shortlisted like 10 names over like 3 hours and just came up with that.
Awesome. Wow. It definitely does spark a lot of conversations with that name.
Yes. Oh, you know what? Actually, I have to give some credit to Michael Yu, actually. You know what? It was, it also had a big part to do with Michael Yu. When I was recording the Oakland podcast, we had Adam and Matt Scalina, and they came on and Michael made a joke about they're the podfathers of Vancouver real estate.
Okay.
Yeah. And then that kind of stuck in my brain. Yeah. And I was trying to figure out if there was a better name for the business, and there just wasn't.
Right.
Yeah. Credit to Michael Yu.
So out of all the podcasters you help produce their episodes, what is the one theme that you find in all of us? Or like trait or skill that we have innately? Nothing that, obviously the skills that Tony and I have acquired, we've just developed over our experience
Yes.
of
Yeah.
190 episodes by now. But like, what's the one thing that you find that's consistent in all of us?
Well, so I work on almost entirely like branded podcasts, right? Like businesses that want to start a podcast to market their business. It makes sense that the entirety, well, first of all, you have to have something, somebody has to have something to say, right? You can't, it's not very often where you get a podcast that's hosted by someone who is like particularly introverted. Like it's usually people that want to get out there, want to put themselves out there in the world. That's number one. Number two, definitely like forward thinking, like I don't want to say creative, but definitely more open minded, forward thinking people who are okay with embracing new technologies. That seems to be a theme. You get there's a lot of people, especially I'm sure as you know in real estate, who are just like they want the status quo. They want it's mostly other. I find it's mostly with like kind of the older, stuffier brokerages, but like it's like traditional print media is the way to go. That's how we're going to advertise our company. Whereas everybody who's going with podcasting is people that's understanding that they can reach a different audience. Like they can reach that podcasts are most popular with the kind of 25 to 45-year-old age range.
Okay.
So if you're really wanting to hit that age range and like speak to them, podcasting is such a great way to do it. And people that recognize that long form content is more effective than short form because you literally have an hour. If you're selling something, whether you're hard selling or soft selling, like most podcasts are soft sells, but like you have an hour or half an hour, 45 minutes to like capture somebody's attention, make them fall in love with you and hear your pitch. Whereas with a social media ad, you have less than a second usually. I think it's like a 3/4 of a second before somebody moves along, whether they decide whether to click on that ad or not, right?
Yeah.
So you just have it's so much more effective. If you can hook somebody into 2 episodes and they fall in love with your personality, you're set, right?
Totally.
So
Yeah.
and then the third thing I would say is like there has to be some sort of budget there, right? Like, so what do you have more of? Like, if you have more time than money, then you should edit your own podcast. But if you have more, like, if you have a budget, a marketing budget in your business, and you have very little time, it makes sense to hire somebody to do it, right? So those are the three things. So, I guess, yeah, a budget, a marketing budget, yeah, there has to be a forward thinking person and they have to be kind of outgoing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so being outgoing, you think that actually has a big factor in producing really good episodes, like good content?
Yeah. A podcast is first and foremost, doesn't matter what the purpose of your podcast is, a podcast is an entertainment medium, right?
Okay.
So it has to be entertaining. If it's not entertaining, like you can, for sure, there's podcasts out there where it's garbage audio quality, but the entertainment factor makes up for that, right? So you can get away with I mean, you're gonna lose listeners from having bad audio, but 100% of your listeners are going away if your podcast isn't entertaining. Like it has to like be engaging and entertaining. So
Okay.
that's a huge boon. Like that for growth and success, like you have to be engaging.
Okay. And so now talking about the budget,
hmm
doing it yourself versus hiring somebody like yourself to
hmm
do it, how much really are they saving? Because you have to look at time as a factor as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I mean, it just comes down to how much do you value your time, right? Like if you look in your job and you're making, let's say you're making $60 an hour, and then you go try and like edit this podcast. And most people that don't know how to edit a podcast, the editing is the really time consuming part. But let's say you spend 2 hours recording a podcast and then you go to edit it. I know people that I have one client who's editing her, she just records here and then she edits it herself. And she's like, why am I doing this? She's literally spends 8 hours, 8 to 12 hours, depending on the length of the episode, editing. So she's spending an entire day. So let's say on the smaller end of that, she's spending 2 hours recording and 8 hours editing. That's 10 hours. If she makes $60 an hour in her job, which is conservative estimate for Vancouver, that's $600. And so anything under $600 an episode, you're saving money basically. So it
Yeah.
comes down to how much you value your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely appreciate everything that you guys are doing behind the scenes here because even to this day, after 4 years, I really have no clue where the material or how it's uploaded or anything like that. And I don't care to know.
Yeah, exactly. That's hilarious. I have a story. Like one time I was setting things up. I had just bought it was early days of Oakwin, and I had just bought pop filters. So like these things that go in front of the mic, and every time you go or like the P's and B's, they're called plosives. It stops those from happening. And now we have these like kind of fancier little kind of broadcast filters on, which do the same thing, and they don't look as ugly. But I was setting these up in front of the mics before we started doing video with Oakwin, and Michael came into the room. It was at his house. We were recording at the time, and he came into the room and he goes, "Oh, what's that you're setting up there?" And so I started explaining to him exactly that sentence that I just said to you right now. "Oh, it's for the plosives when you say a P and a B." And he just stopped me. He's like, you know what? Just forget I asked. I actually really don't want to know. I was just curious, but I realized that I don't want to know. And carry on. And he walked away, and I was like, that's my client. That's exactly who I want as a client, because I don't want somebody who's I have had clients before, especially in the music industry, where they would it's an artist who's like kind of a producer and kind of knows a little bit about mixing, and they would want to come in and like sit in on the editing process and the mixing process, and they would want to like they'd be like, "Can I take this home and do my own vocal tuning and save $100 on this song?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, you can do that, but it's gonna be done poorly. Like, do you know what you're doing?" And they're like, "No, I can figure it out though. There's YouTube videos and stuff," right? That's not the kind of client that I really want to be worked with, because the product isn't going to come out as good as it would, right? I don't want to put my name on something that's been half done by somebody else. So yeah, it's it definitely, you don't want to be trying to like do stuff yourself if you don't know what you're doing, because it's not going to come out as professional.
Yeah. And when you're sitting behind the scenes and you're listening to these podcasts as they're being recorded, are you finding like a specific structure that is consistent with all these podcasters? So Tony and I, for example, we have like an intro. So that's kind of our segment one, call it. And then our segment two is, what can our listeners actually take away from the episode? And then segment three is introducing the services and offerings from our guest.
Yeah.
So do you typically find that most podcasters are just winging it and just getting a feel and flow of what's happening during that recording? Or is it more structured that tends to gravitate to a lot of listeners?
Well, going back to the idea that most of what I do is branded podcasts. So it's very typical. Like there's kind of two typical structures, which is the two that you guys have. And the first one is, if you have a guest, then usually there's an intro, there's a little bit of sort of, maybe it's banter, or maybe it's introducing the guest, and then you have another little transition piece. You have the body of the podcast, which is the interview, and then you have your outro, which is thanking the listeners, asking for reviews, telling them where you can find your podcast and your business and stuff like that. So that's a standard format. And then the other one would be when you don't have a guest, then you're looking at more of a kind of just the intro, and then the main body, and then the outro. So those are two standard kind of formats. And for sure, you can get more complicated than that. But then it gets really, then it turns into, if you have a really complicated formatting structure, then it takes a lot of back and forth. It takes a lot of time between recording and release. And so it just complicates things a lot more, and it adds a lot more expenses. If you want to start including sound effects, if you want to start including like separate multiple interviews, like journalistic style stuff, people don't understand, but that takes a lot of time and effort. Like I've had people ask me, I want to do a podcast like The Daily. And I'll be like, okay, that's great. You can do a podcast like The Daily, but like you're probably, you're not going to pay anything less than 10 grand an episode. And they're like, 10 grand? Why would it cost so much money? And I said, well, have you ever listened to an episode of The Daily? Go listen to one right now and listen to the very last like 3 minutes of the podcast and listen to who is involved with the podcast. You'll hear about a team of about 35 names. That many people. An episode of The Daily probably costs $100,000, right? So it's like, yeah, it's just a lot of work to start doing all that sort of interviews, journalistic stuff, field recordings, like all that sort of stuff. And it takes a lot of time and money. So yeah, most people, branded podcasts, they just stick to the interview style, interview or solo podcasts where you're just giving information, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, the funny thing is that I think a lot of people find they don't really know what to talk about, or they don't. So would it be where they have to kind of already have a business going or a brand going, and then they add in this medium into as a
Yeah.
tool to engage with their audience?
Yeah. For the branded stuff, it's either got to be a business or an idea, right? So you can have a podcast that's not promoting a business, but it's got to be a good idea that people are going to want to listen to. And you'd be very surprised at how far you can niche down and still have an audience, right? Like I met a couple, these two girls that they get together every Friday night and they get drunk and they watch Xena Warrior Princess and they record themselves like getting drunker and drunker and commenting on the episode of Xena.
Yeah.
And they probably have like 150 at least downloads per episode, right? And it's you can niche as long as it's good content, you're gonna find an audience, right?
It's kind of like I don't know if you ever tuned into Call Me Daddy when
Yeah.
she was doing it with her co-host
Right.
before
Back in
she
the
was
day.
purchased by
Yeah.
Spotify, and it was just really about dating
Yeah.
and like their dating life.
Yeah. Yeah,
And like and then
exactly.
it just became a thing about people tuning in and guests coming on to talk about some of their dating life and the ups and downs of being single
Yeah.
and in a relationship too.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, but that's not even really that niche. That's like who in the
That's the same.
world hasn't had an experience with dating, right? That's
Yeah.
a super,
Super relatable.
yeah,
Oh my
totally. I have
gosh.
another podcast that's been going for about 3 or 4 months now. It's called Actual Play Entertainment. And it's like literally they play Dungeons and Dragons or like another like live action role playing game, or that's not the right word. And it's some sort of like creative imagination game, actual play game is what they call them. And I kind of, when I first heard that, I was like, how are you gonna, that's cool. I can work on this podcast, but I can't see it going too long because like, how are you going to make money off this? And he's like, okay, we're going to start a Patreon. Right. And I was like, okay, do you think you'll have enough like people to like listening to that, like paying money into that Patreon to keep your podcast going? He's like, I think so. I mean, there seems to be a pretty big interest in this, and this is a world that's not my world, so I don't know this, right?
Right.
And like, yeah, it's been going for the last year and a half, and I think they're making enough money off their Patreon to like keep the podcast going, which is amazing,
That's
right?
pretty cool. That's
So,
really niche.
yeah, it's super niche, right? But there's an audience for everything, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that gets me thinking like, we've I've never really liked our like logo and branding, like our colors. I think we would just put it like together right away without really knowing the direction of it. Like we had like a 2 to 3 page business plan.
Yeah.
And then over time, you realize that you really want to get down to a specific like target market.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you end up wanting to change certain things because I grow out of things too.
Yeah, for
Like my
sure.
logo as
Yeah.
a realtor has changed like 5 times.
Yeah. Yeah.
So have you really seen like in this podcasting scene, what direction, like in Vancouver specifically, like where people are out of all the podcasters that you are recording, like is there a specific huge big audience where like a lot of people are interested, like maybe think the Canucks or sports?
Like a specific topic?
Like a specific topic or like categories or genres that are more popular than the other? Or is it,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, it's
yeah?
Vancouver real estate. Like
Okay, that's why there's like 5 of them at least in Vancouver.
There's like 5 of them in my portfolio. In Vancouver, I don't even know how many now. Like it used to be just Vancouver Real Estate Podcast, but then since that was 2016 they started. And since then, yeah, there's probably, I mean, just Vancouver, there's probably at least 15 to 20 at least. And that's probably a conservative estimate, but
Right.
there's a lot of real estate
Oh,
podcasts now
I did
because
not know that.
what do people talk about
I
in
thought maybe
Vancouver?
there's maybe a handful.
You know what I'm surprised about is that there's 2 things people talk about in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Real estate
Yeah.
and
The Canucks?
Well, I guess
Weather?
the weather.
weather,
I'm
okay.
surprised there's not more weather podcasts. Right?
Because I guess because it always changes and
Yeah, it's a quick
it's hard to follow.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd
Yeah.
be a pretty
Okay,
weird.
obviously I haven't been checking my competition or peers. I just know the five because they're from Oakwood.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say other agents want to start their own real estate podcast.
Mhm.
How can they make how can they make compelling content or differentiate themselves from the other 15?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question because I get that question like from realtors like asking me about starting a podcast, and the answer is always exactly what we were just talking about: niche down. Find okay, here's real estate. Like, you want to start a podcast where you're just talking about straight up Vancouver real estate in general, you're going to be competing against the juggernaut that is the Vancouver Real Estate Podcast, which is a terrible idea to compete against like a very popular podcast.
Yeah.
So niche off, like find, go into something like talk about specifically about Vancouver pre-sales, talk about specifically about Vancouver rental developments or the rental market, or talk about like something that's not so generalized. Because if you're talking to everybody, you're kind of talking to nobody, and you can make that work if you're the first in, but like you have to kind of niche down into something in order to like branch off and find that like hardcore audience, the dedicated audience. And so that's the advice that I give every single person that comes to me like with a big like overall general idea. It's like, okay, how can we narrow this down and like actually make it speak to somebody, right? And those are the most successful podcasts that I work on aside from VRAP, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they niche specifically in like pre-sales,
Yeah.
tenancy, whatever, rentals,
Yeah.
then wouldn't the longevity of that podcast be shorter?
No, because there's things are that, like, let's say, for example, it's a pre-sales podcast. There's always new pre-sales coming out. Let's say you're talking about those two topics. Let's say you're talking about tenancy. The tenancy laws are always changing. And even if they're not, there's always new cases that you could talk about. So if you
real
want to do
case studies that are that the landlord and the tenant are dealing with.
Yeah.
So you bring in like lawyers or property managers who actually probably share really true stories.
Exactly. And there's no shortage of either of those types of people, right? So like there's always something within every genre or within every topic or every niche that like you can pull out and be like, this is an interesting thing that could be evergreen content. And like, we can always fall back on this. Yeah, for sure. We're going to get we're going to have this I got this cool idea for, talking about this new law that's coming out. But then if you don't have something for next week, then okay, let's fall back. Let's find a case study to talk about. And like that case studies are anecdotes. There's stories, and they're always going to be interesting to people. Like humans in general, like hearing stories. Those are the most successful short form videos too, right? Like if you think about like people like Mr. Beast, who's like the most popular YouTuber, and how popular he's gotten with his, not just his long form videos, but his shorts. And the reason is because every short has a story. It has like this storyline where there's like a setup, and then there is the middle of it, then there's the conclusion, and it's literally a story within a short.
I don't even know what Mr. Beast is. What is that?
He's literally just the biggest YouTuber in the world.
What does he talk about?
Like he does, I feel like nowadays, I don't know, I've kind of fallen off with what he's doing because he's kind of, so he, like a lot of his stuff is like kind of game showy almost. Like he's so rich that he'll just like, he does the weird stuff. Like, you remember those game shows where you'd throw somebody in a fan booth and dump a bunch of money in, and they have 30 seconds to collect that money.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that. Like,
what?
Like he throws money at people and like they have to get it. And like, it's kind of like gotten to the point where he's so rich and he like just does things with money that he's kind of like, he's definitely using people and their like desperation to like become famous.
So he's luring people with money.
Yeah.
Like all I imagine right now is him in a robe. Like is he in a robe?
Probably. I think there's a lot of videos where he has a robe on.
Okay.
Yeah. But he dresses mostly just like a normal guy, like t-shirts and jeans and stuff. But like, yeah, he's gotten to the point where he's kind of exploiting. He's kind of become a bit exploitative, and him and him and a couple other influencers recently started like this awful, like it's like supposed to be a competitor to Lunchables, and it's just basically not even food. It's insane.
Ew.
Anyways, he's gone down the rabbit hole.
Oh.
But the point of him is like his videos are so successful because it's a story. People love stories. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the boring part, the statistics part of the back end. I don't really pay attention too much to how many listeners or viewers we get. And maybe I should, just then our content can improve.
Yeah.
But I just want to, put out things that I know that has helped me in my business, and I know that has helped others in the business. But looking back at statistics on the back end, what is like an average? Is there even such an average number of
Not really.
viewers? Like, how do we know if we're actually putting out good content besides the engagement? Like people physically and like verbally coming up to us and saying, "We love your podcast."
Yeah. I mean, everybody has different metrics, right? Like a realtor, for example, I always have to come back to realtors because I have so many realtor clients, but like a realtor could have 100 downloads per show. And for somebody else, that might be a very small amount of people. But if you have 100 downloads per show, that means you probably have 300 overall listens because streams aren't calculated in there. So it's usually a 2x ratio. So for every 100 downloads, you can generalize that there's probably about 200 streams. So 300 people listening per show. If one of those people buy a house with that realtor at the average commission rate of the average sale home in Vancouver, that probably is going to pay for your entire year of podcasting. And so like success metrics are so skewed that like, for Lululemon, for example, they have a podcast, but their podcast isn't selling one specific product that they make a lot of money off of. It's more so they sell low value items in context, low value items at high quantities. And so for that type of podcast, you're more looking at like brand awareness, right? Nobody's going on the Lululemon podcast to say, buy this shoe, like buy this set, like these yoga pants, because they're going to make us a ton of money off of this particular podcast. Right. No, it's more about brand awareness, right? So for them, they need a lot more listeners to make it worth it for their podcast. So
it's more probably about like wellness and about maybe even entrepreneurship, like getting yoga teachers or wellness and health practitioners to come on the podcast.
Yeah, well, they have so many revenue streams. So like, anything that supports those revenue streams is going to be beneficial coming out of the podcast, right? But I guess the point is like you have to look at you can't say what's a good amount of listeners to have on a show. You have to take a step back and look at what's your goal of that podcast, and then how do you define success? And if you define success as one sale a month, then 100 listeners for your podcast or 300 listeners is awesome. Like that could easily translate into one sale a month, right? So what's your success metric? And then what does that mean for audience? And you can kind of reverse engineer it that way.
Yeah. So on our podcast, when we wrote out our business plan, it was never about to make money, to make more deals or transactions.
Which was concerning to me because I want to keep you as a long-term client.
Well, we're still here. We're still here. We're one of your OGs.
Yeah, exactly.
But what we really wanted to do was just change and make an impact in our community of peers. And I think from this experience, I would have to say that our relationship and our negotiation strategy with agents have really changed.
Really?
For that reason.
Are you serious?
Yeah, because people would come up and say, they'll say that they're complimenting our podcast. And then they see us as credible agents. So if we're in a multiple offer, they understand what we value.
Yeah.
That we're easy to work with, that we're friendly, and that we're trying to make it a win-win situation versus it's all about me, it's all about my client, right? So I think that has really changed just how people approach us and how we approach deals too.
Yes.
So even just that, you can't put a metric on it, right?
No, that's the knock-on effect of a podcast. Like the kind of, regardless of what your goal or your metric is for podcasting, if they get through an episode and then they move on to the next episode, by the time they're done listening to 2-3 episodes, they already most likely, if they're hooked on the podcast, they know, like, and trust you, right?
Right.
Which have been like the traditional metrics of sales, like how you get success in
Exactly.
sales.
Exactly.
And so that makes perfect sense to me that like people, you might not even know who they are or have ever met them, but they've listened to your podcast, you meet them for the first time, before you even talk to them, they already know, like, and trust you because they've listened to like, I don't know, maybe 2 episodes, maybe 100 episodes of your
Mhm.
podcast, right?
Mhm.
And that's the amazing knock-on effect that, like, it's really hard to put that in words when I'm when I'm having sales calls or like discovery calls with people, it's hard to put it into words how effective that is for
Mhm.
like for, your business when people already know you and trust you and call you up hoping that you'll work with them instead of the reverse.
Absolutely, Brayden. We obviously started during the pandemic, and I didn't start my brokerage yet.
Right. Yeah.
And people would actually tune into my podcast, like maybe they're people who just wrote the exam or they're
Yeah.
considering switching their brokerages, and they have already listened to some of the episodes for
Yeah.
In the House. And they would be joining just because they love what I have to deliver, what I have to share.
Hmm.
And it's so different from other managing brokers who just completely aren't like innovative. They're not forward thinking. They're
Yeah.
not, maybe their culture in their brokerages, like they're hiding secrets and everybody's just
Hierarchical, right?
very,
Yeah.
very much so. And I think we started this podcast just because we just want to share business tips and strategies.
Yeah.
And pretty much that was our why. Like we were wondering why we needed to be in real estate because we felt like family and social life and health was a priority.
Yes.
So we created the podcast to make a difference in people's like areas of success. So it really has come to a very like it just feels really good
Yeah.
to be able to help.
I never even thought about that, like that how much of a benefit that would be for like the podcast would be for you starting your brokerage, right? And did
Never thought.
Tony's running a brokerage now too. How she wasn't running it when she started the podcast, right? She was kind of on her
It's a
way to taking it
family.
over.
Yeah, it's a family
Yeah.
owned. And I think now that over the last couple years, her dad has kind of retired
Yeah.
and kind of handed it off to her. So
That probably benefits her too. Like she's probably felt the same
oh,
knock-on benefit, right?
absolutely. I mean, even just like sitting next to Tony, learning from her, and then maybe even me sharing my experience becoming a realtor to a managing broker to a broker owner as well, like just like us feeding off of each other. And like, obviously, Oakland is a lot larger than Bel Air,
Yeah.
but I find that there's something to learn from, the mom and pop, the family business
Yeah,
that
for
I can
sure.
take to what we have now, like over 800 agents, to
Yeah.
something like where what we've developed and for her to implement it in some of her business systems too.
Yeah, it works both
It
ways,
works
right?
both
Yeah.
ways. And I think that's why we have like such a good like just relationship that way because she sees it one way, I see another, but we come together and it's very much like a marriage that we have on the podcast here is
Mhm.
that it's a yin and yang in a way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you guys it's amazing how much you've both grown like as podcasters and it seemingly as people as well. Like just
Mhm.
I guess probably a lot of that is due to like the friendship that you've developed, like
Mhm.
you two together and but it's been great to see that. And from my perspective, how much you've like basically how confident you've gotten behind the mic since
Mhm.
since you started, like, has been amazing to see as well, like, because you both have great voices, but, like, just the flow of the conversation and the ease of, like, just everything has just you can tell that it's so comfortable and natural with you now, which is awesome,
Oh,
and
thank
it makes
you.
our job as editors easier too.
Actually, share maybe you don't need to name any names or podcaster names,
Mhm.
but like like a really bad experience with someone who just didn't know what they're doing or didn't know what to say on the podcast. Like, did you like witness any of that at all?
Um
Or were they like fully prepared because they're entrepreneurs?
It's yeah, most people do come, like, fairly prepared, but it's, like, it's always kind of a little bit difficult when you see somebody who doesn't have they kind of, it's not that, maybe it's not that they clam up in front of the mic, but they just don't have a great kind of flow of conversation naturally. It must be clamming up in front of the mic, because most of the people that this happens to, they're totally fine in a conversation, but then when they get in front of the mic, I think probably what usually happens, what's the biggest issue, is when people try and script their podcast, right? Like, you remember the first episode you
Oh,
guys did, you tried to
yes.
script the whole thing,
Yes.
and it's not like the audience can't tell that it's scripted, right? So I always tell people, if I can beat one thing into them, it's come with talking points, don't
Okay.
come with a script, because
Okay.
people can absolutely 100% hear that it's a script, unless you are like a professional speaker. Like politicians can read off a script, a teleprompter, and like, but they've trained for years and years and years to do
Yeah.
that. As like a normal member of the public, if you're reading a script, it is so incredibly painfully obvious.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's the biggest thing that I think is, I don't think we've ever had any like disasters on the show or anything like that. We've had episodes like of the Oakland podcast where we finish an episode, we do like a happy hour episode, and we finish, and then everybody sits back, and Michael or Morgan will say, "That was garbage. We can't use that." And we all agree, "Yes, okay, let's throw it in the trash. Like, it was a good try, right?"
Oh,
But
yeah.
like, aside from that, there's not been really too many disasters.
I
Yeah.
think Tony and I had one episode where we were like, we're not releasing this to the
Yeah.
public. There's no way. There's no good content in here. And I remember the very first episode too. I sounded like a robot, and then I was reading off the script, and Tony was like,
Mhm.
I can't read off the script. It's making me more nervous. So we were complete opposite that way.
Yeah.
So last question here.
Mhm.
How do you ensure that there's no burnout? Like, you're probably seeing us, we're all go-getters. We're all probably type A people
Yeah.
who are working on these podcasts. How do we do it without burning out? Because we're already so inundated with Instagram reels and YouTube videos, and it's just another thing for us to do. So
Yeah.
how do we prevent that?
I mean, you can look at the metrics. If your one thing you can do is you can look at the metrics. If your podcast is hitting the goals that you wanted to hit, that can be a motivating factor.
Mm.
But another thing you can do is slow it down a little bit. Like, if you're you guys are a great example of this, where I think you saw that you were like, oh my God, we're this is taking up so much of our time and so much of our resources, and like, it's costing a lot of money, and we just got to slow it down a bit. Let's bump it back to once every 2 weeks instead of every single week. And that's one thing you can do if you're starting to burn out. Another thing that some people do, and they've designed this into their podcast, is design seasons, right? So they'll go, maybe they're doing like I have one podcast where they do a 12 episode season, and then they will do a wrap up episode that's kind of like, this has been an amazing season. Here's all the things that highlights of the season. And then they take a break for 3 months, and then they come back and they do another 12 episode season for like every single week for 12 episodes. But we'll batch them. We'll get started like maybe a month in advance, and we'll start editing them so that we have 3 or 4 episodes ready by even the time the first episode comes out.
Mhm.
But then they do another season, and that's like 3 months worth of content. Then they take another 3-month break. And that's a way that they can kind of like recharge, come up with new ideas, start poking around for new guests, and kind of like, yeah, just keep it always fresh and interesting, and like keep themselves from burning out. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are 3 tips, I guess, that you can kind of use. But you gotta, like, if the podcast isn't hitting the goals that you've set for yourself, then you gotta maybe think about, is there something we can do to retool it, or is this the right thing that for our business?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not the right thing, but I argue that it's, if you've set it up right, that it should, like, a podcast should always be a benefit for your business, right? And
Right.
if it's not doing that, then there's something wrong there, because I've seen personally quite a bit of success with almost every single one of my clients. Like, they've had some sort of benefit to their business, some sort of goals, because as a direct result of the podcast. So it makes it, that's what keeps me going, is like
Mhm.
seeing that, like, the success and the happiness, and how people grow as people and as podcasters, and how it's been able to grow their business.
Mhm.
It's been really, Really nice to see you.
Yeah, it's been so fruitful to be working with the Podfather Creative. And if you guys, any of the listeners are looking to start a podcast, please reach out. How do they find you?
Well, if you want to check out some of the work we do, you can go to podfathercreative.com, or you can check out any of the podcasts that we work on, specifically in the house. And if you want to reach out directly, you can email me, Brayden, Brayden, at podfathercreative.com, or give me a call or text, 604-328-9940.
This wasn't to actually sell Brayden services.
But it's nice that we can do this.
I want to talk about, we've never had a topic on how to start a podcast, right?
Yeah.
So it's perfect that Tony couldn't make it today. She's going to be in later this afternoon. Mm-hmm. But I'm really glad that we have you as a guest.
Yeah, it's very meta.
Thanks, Brayden. Thanks, listeners. Thanks for tuning in.